So do a quick primer on Václav Havel for people who don't know this person. He was extremely famous and important, as you've been saying, in that era, and has been basically forgotten since. And I know that he's very
Yep.
important to you and very influential. But as an intellectual, like, how would you summarize his thinking? His
Well,
ideas.
so he's a playwright. He was an
Right.
absurdist playwright from the 60s. Prague was, as mentioned before, kind of unnaturally stifled
Hmm.
for a 40-year period. But there was an opening in the 60s, known as Prague Spring,
Mm-hmm.
where a bunch of writers, playwrights, and movie directors, Milan Kundera comes to mind, but he's not at all the only one. Just sort of the Milan Kundera on the writing side, but Milos Forman, I should say, on the film side.
Okay.
Great, really open, crazy movies. The Fireman's Ball, Black Peter. These are really terrific, and you can enjoy them yourselves to this day. So this ferment happens. Havel is part of that ferment, both in the kind of absurdist, kind of Kafka-esque almost, but even more deliberately funny. Sometimes people think that Kafka is like it's all about twisty and dark, even though people were laughing when they were reading it back in the original
Mm-hmm.
day. But Havel was trying to get laughs. He worked at a theater with a bunch of like-minded people, doing a bunch of speed and like pushing the limits of what you could say. And in the later years, but also then too, like the kind of bleeding edge for trying to get messages out there, subversive messages, really happened in the theater. Prague has a long tradition of really interesting theater, so people went there for that.
Mm.
And he also got involved with the writers union and started writing more publicly, and there's a series of different publications that got more bold, like critiquing the current system as being sort of anti-humanist
Mm.
and anti-individualist. And
Mm-hmm.
he would write open letters and essays at the time, highlighting the inhumanity of it and the absurdity of it, in addition to his theatrical work. So in August of 1968, enough is enough. The Czechs are going too far, and the Soviet Union sends in tanks to crush the Prague Spring.
Right.
It takes a while for the entire humiliation process to go through. By January of 69, I think is when Jan Palach, a student, lit himself on fire on Wenceslas Square in
Mm.
protest of it, which
Mm.
had a profound impact. And they then set in a period that they called normalization, which is one of the reasons why the American, Trump era use of normalization scratches at me a bit.
Mm.
I know that word differently, or like more poignantly, let's say.
Mm.
But so normalization is just like, it becomes this really totalizing and insincere, like almost ritually insincere communist system. Like, that your local Czech leader or whatever is a puppet now explicitly of Moscow, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so everyone, a lot of people, hundreds of thousands of people left. If you know a Czech person of a certain age, they left in 1968,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or their
Right.
kids did too,
Right.
just like Hungary in 1956.
56. Yeah.
It's a terrible thing, and did a lot of damage to a lot of people. So Havel, like most intellectuals who stayed, kind of sat around licking their wounds, like bewildered. They could no longer work. Some of them would be arrested or harassed. Their kids, their family would be treated badly. They couldn't get into good schools. I mean, there's just every single way, every lever being pulled. And what changed him, and keeping in mind that he had been a pretty outspoken intellectual, both as a critic of the regime and then also in his absurdist plays. So he had been there before, but then he kind of went into a fallow period. And then the Plastic People of the Universe, a filthy rock band full of hippies who played Velvet Underground and Frank Zappa covers, their name Plastic People comes from Frank Zappa.
Huh.
Um, they got arrested for disturbing the peace. And uh, and something inside of Havel snapped. And there's a great essay he writes about this. He decided to cover their trial. They didn't. There
Ooh.
wasn't any press in the country that
Yeah.
he could write for.
Not
He's like,
allowed.
I don't give a shit. In fact, in his pieces that are collected in a book called Open Letters that I recommend everybody read. It's great. He's covering this trial, and it's being smuggled out by Samizdat. People are typing. He types it originally, and then friends type it out using carbon paper and then they smuggle it to visiting friends, maybe in Germany or maybe in Austria, who then send it to Toronto, where expatriate Czechs run a place called, I think, 68 Publishers, something like that. It was a great press for exiled Czech and other Central European literature.
Hmm.
So he's writing this ultimately for a foreign audience, but he doesn't care, and he's like, and he knows that some of this is going to be caught, and he's like, watching this parade of people come in and out of the courtyard, and also knowing the class of both intellectuals and apparatchiks who are self-satisfiedly telling themselves that, oh well, maybe they've gone too far with arresting these people, but you really have to know how to behave. He goes, watching all of this and thinking about it makes me feel anew and afresh for the first time. And hey, Mr. Censor, pay special attention to this next sentence, that I am done with these cunts. And so, like, he snapped. And after, as and some of those words might be slightly askew, but it's the basic spirit of it. Yeah. And so as a result of that, he and his friends started first a group called Against the Unjustly Prosecuted. It started with the Plastic People to defend them, and then it became Charter 77. Charter 77, an immensely influential group.
Yes. Right.
Of initially like 100 people, maybe fewer, who just wrote an open letter to the Czechoslovak government saying, you are in violation of the written constitution and of your international obligations under the treaties that were negotiated in the mid-70s in Sweden, and I'm just sort of blanking on the names, but not a Geneva Convention things, but anyways, the things that were actually criticized by a lot of anti-communists at home as being too namby-pamby. But Gerald Ford got the commies to sign these sort of international declarations of human rights that the commies insincerely signed, and Havel said, nope. That says here, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. You got to live up to it. They signed their names on it publicly. He wrote one of the greatest pieces, two of the greatest pieces in the history of anti-totalitarian literature. First one was an open letter to Dr. Gustav Hasek, who was the guy who led the country, saying basically in great, incredibly detailed form, your whole system is based on lies, full of shit, and you know it, and I know it. And then this other essay, The Power of the Powerless, that talks about what happens when people stop living the lie, when they start showing the bravery of saying, I don't care, I'm going to get arrested, fuck you, here's what I'm going to do. So that's what they did. They all got arrested. He spent most of the next 5 years in jail.
Wow.
But this sort of burbling of dissidents, especially as the stuff was smuggled out under Samizdat stuff, then influenced the Solidarity movement in Poland. Then it started creating all this sort of a really interesting group of dissident literature, not all of which agreed with one another. I mean, there's Catholic dissidents don't have the same ideas as Czech atheists, but they had, a fundamental thing in common, and they're all starting to kind of organize and think to one another, and having more and more influence. Eventually, so the 80s kind of happen, and he's in and out of jail and always under surveillance, but still writing very openly and critically and very well against the regime. And then Velvet Revolution happens, starts on November 17th of 1989, in which students my age again, and I know several people who were there that night, gathered on National Street, Národní, nearby their National Theater, and were to protest. I think it was the anniversary of some bad thing that happened during '68, and so their parents are all like, "Don't do it, don't go out, because we remember what happened to us when we were your age and we went out, we got crushed." And the kids, being kids, were like, "Fuck you, I'm going." And they went out, and all the streets were kind of closed off, and they were beaten real bad. In fact, there was a widely disseminated news report by Václav Havel's future press secretary, who then was a correspondent for Reuters, saying that one of the kids had been beaten to death. That was false. It was fake news. Thought it was true. It wasn't making it up, but it turned out not to be true. But all of the parents heard that one of our students got beaten to death, and they're like, "No, fuck you. We're coming out tomorrow." And in the course of 10, 12 days, those protests went from 50,000 to 1 million. And Havel was let out of prison. I think maybe just a few days before any of that. Spoke at Wenceslas Square with Alexander Dubček, who had been the leader in '68, who had been summoned to Moscow and humiliated. Also, dissident singers who no one had heard from for 20 years all show up on a balcony and sing these great old protest songs and the Czech national anthem. And by the end of that year, and something that starts literally on November 17th, Havel is sworn in as president. The communists are gone. There is no more single party dominating things, and like no one died. It's one of the most amazing stories. The Velvet Revolution. And part of the reason why it's called the Velvet Revolution, yes, it's because no one got killed, unlike in Romania. And some of the other places, although most on balance, the 1989 revolutions were pretty peaceful. And that's thanks to someone who I otherwise don't have a great deal of praise for, which is Mikhail Gorbachev. He has some reason to do of the comparative bloodlessness.
That's right. He gave up.
He gave up. That's important. But it's also called the Velvet Revolution because of the plastic people of the universe being really into the Velvet Underground.
It's awesome.
And so like when Lou Reed first came to interview Václav Havel for Rolling Stone magazine in June of 1990, in an interview I don't think it ever got published because Lou Reed is not the world's brightest bulb. Wonderful musician. The first thing that Havel says to him is like, "Do you know that I'm president because of you?" And Lou Reed's like, "What? What are you talking about?"
Right.
Which I love as much as I love anything.
Now, I just realized Mr. Havel is over your right shoulder.
Yes.
Yeah, we haven't mentioned that yet.
Yeah.
While you were doing that, he was looking at us.
Leszek. Yes.
Yeah.
It's the only poster you'll ever see me have of a politician.